Hi, and welcome to your first class in Gender Studies. Now, you might have already been wondering this. Why study gender, culture, and communication? Well, let's look at a few points. We are exposed to the media's regular offer of advice and commentary on the subject of sex and gender. What's interesting is that, and I'll bring this up several times in the course, is that they're not always clear about what the difference between sex and gender. They often use them interchangeably, so we'll look at this further in. In the movies, social media, news, and most other media-related platforms can and do influence our point of view on sex, sexuality, and gender. Another point. And this is one that might surprise you, but maybe it doesn't because you enrolled in this course. That student demand for courses in gender and communication is high. Students are really very eager to understand sex and gender. A third point to why you would want to consider looking at this, gender, communication, and culture is learning to better understand the relationship between gender and culture and communication can be empowering for us in our personal and professional lives. So research on gender, well, communication and culture has been going on for some time. However, it was in around the 1980s that gender communication and culture has been a growing area in what is known as interdisciplinary research. So that's multiple disciplines of different areas of research. In 2006 was the first handbook. When you think about that, 2006, it's really late in our sort of humanity to be looking at a handbook of gender and communication. But that was the year the first handbook on gender and communication was published. And then another point is that research on gender just takes place in many academic fields, and researchers use a variety of methods and a variety of perspectives to study gender, and we're going to review these this week. So some reasons that you might explore and want to learn about communication, gender, and culture. Studying these topics serve important goals. Learning about gender helps you understand how culture influences our understandings of who we are and who others are. Now that's a combination of sociology and psychology along with gender studies to respond to that kind of query. In addition, studying gender and culture communication patterns is going to help you gain insight about your own beliefs and communication patterns so that you can make better and more informed choices about who you would like to be and how you would like to interact with others in your society. So your effectiveness as a communicator will be increased as you learn and understand and adapt to the more diverse variety of communication styles. So let's get started by first introducing the topic of what is sex, what is gender, a very brief overview on culture. That's a whole another course in sociology, and then we'll also define and sort of look at the issues of communication. So the theoretical approaches to gender, we're going to look at qualitative research methods which gather data that can be quantified. That means it can be counted so you can see and hear it to be able to count it. And analyze the data to draw conclusions. Now, the more common quantitative methods, descriptive statistics, these are things that you can look at and it describes populations. They come from surveys, or could also include surveys, which are written or orals, looking at the thoughts and attitudes that people have. Or you could be doing experiments, looking at the studies of the relationship between the variables. You control some of the variables and allow the experimental method to have its way and observe the outcome. Now, a qualitative method, it's also known as the interpretive method. The main aim here is to understand the nature or the meaning of the experiences that cannot be quantified. So it's people's point of views, their subjective experience. It's hard to count that. So the two main methods used might be a textual analysis. This would be looking at and studying communication in texts, books, and magazines to see the relationship between communication, culture, and gender. But then also another means of qualitative is ethnography. Now, ethnography is an extensive observation of a very diverse group of people and cultures in order to discover patterns. Now, in addition to qualitative and quantitative, critical research methods identify and contest inequities and problems in social life and offer insights into ways these unwelcoming environments can be created within organizations. Now, critical research it focuses on these sort of inequities and sort of looks for explanations. Now, a mixed research method, this is a combination of two or more methods previously described. The qualitative, quantitative, and critical. Okay, and it's useful in the terms of combining to get multiple types of information. It can be much more comprehensive generated out of that. Now, gender is very transitional, and we could look at and sort of describe it as a transitional era of gender. And I will explain that by saying, the cultural views of gender are in transition. Today, we may be confused or conflicted regarding gender issues about which people of prior generations had a more clear-cut view. All I'm really trying to express is that there was a point in time, perhaps in your parents' or your grandparents' generation, where it was really easy. It was always men, women, nothing in between. It was very black and white. But it doesn't mean that there were not other people who didn't fit within that black and white. You just didn't hear very much about them because it wasn't well received. There was very big stigma. Therefore, today, you might find it much more complex and perhaps confusing because it isn't just black and white. So these confusing attitudes, well, it's hard to put into exact context, but you probably don't prescribe to your grandparents' ideals. But we're likely confused about gender issues. On one level, we think women and men are equal and should have equal rights. On another level, we may hold some of the traditional values and beliefs that men and women aren't equal, that they do different things. So let's look at the difference between men and women. But let's first by considering some genetic differences between man, we could say human, and a banana. Well, we share about 50% of the genetic material between a banana and a man. How about a chimpanzee and a man? Well, we share about 98%. So there's a less than 2% difference between a chimpanzee and a human. So when you think about those two comparators, how much difference can there be between a man and a woman when there's less than 1% genetic difference between men and women? Now, much of the differences are constructed by society. It's constructed by society. They're not viewed the same. Women and men are not viewed in the same way in each culture. Language can alter those differences or highlight those differences, and culture can. So it's difficult to find language to discuss patterns of gendered communication. Just by virtue of saying men and women, that makes it a troublesome term because it's either or. It implies that everybody can fit in one of these two categories. And I hope that through this course you'll discover that that's not necessarily the case. Pop psychology isn't research-based psychology, it's popular content that media will produce that is termed pop psychology, and it suggests that men and women are inherently and distinctly different. Has this been your experience? Perhaps in some ways it has, but perhaps in some ways It hasn't. The differences between men and women are not solely biological and natural. They may also be related to cultural experiences, hereditary, economic class, race, sexual identity. There are a lot of things that will make this issue of sex and gender and the relationship and how it fits with each of us much more complicated. It brings us to a term. The term is called essentializing. Now this occurs when we assume that all members of a group, that is all men or all women, are the same. And it ignores the individual variations and the differences among members of the same sex. Now, while your textbook will discuss generalizations about women and men, it is important to remember that there are not essential qualities possessed by all members of any sex. The differences between sex and gender, now this becomes critical, and the definitions of gender and culture are important to understand gender, culture, and communication. Just as an example, these differences of sex and gender has been interchanged quite a lot in popular media. The Olympics, for example, there's a runner from South Africa, Caster Semenya. She's a middle distance runner, 800, 1500 meters runner, and she's very strong, but she's also got a higher than normal testosterone level in her body, but she is a woman. However, the Olympic Committee, this has gone on since, I believe, 2015-ish, 14, has been saying that she hasn't passed the gender test. That's not what they mean. They're not talking gender. Gender is a socially constructed term. Sex is a biological term, and that's the term they should be saying, because they're saying she has a biological difference from what is atypical, and we'll learn this a little bit later in the next lesson, a cisgender person, a normal woman, if we will. I'll put that in quotes. So even at a high level, if you will, at an International Olympic Committee, will make the call saying that Caster can't run in those events unless she takes a medication that reduces her testosterone. What's interesting, in addition to that, is that there's never been a case of a man having been stopped from competing because his testosterone is too high and asked to lower it. It only happens within women. So it is an interesting dialogue, and it's a confusing one because even the Olympic Committee doesn't get it right. So let's carry on. We're going to go with looking at gender, culture, and communication, and we're going to start, like I've indicated, that sex, gender, sexual orientation, culture, communication are all interlinked. We can't study one without understanding the others. Sex and gender, they are related concepts, but they are not the same. Sex is a designation based on biology. Sex is based on biology and assigned from birth. Whereas gender is socially constructed and socially expressed. It includes gender identity, one's internal sense of self as a man or a woman or neither. It involves gender expression and the external communication of one's gender identity. That is the way you dress, the way you speak, the way you appear, the mannerisms that you have, the gender roles that you play, and the cultural expectations assigned to one's sex. But I want to break these down and spend a little bit of time on each one. So we'll start with sex. Sex is based on external genitalia and internal sex organs. These are determined by chromosomes. Now most people, I'm sure most of you are aware, but most people have two sex chromosomes, which produce a female, XX, or a male, XY. Now for every 500 or so people, one does not have an XX or an XY sex chromosomes, meaning around, and this is a US number, and it sort of matches similarly in Canada, in the United States do not have XX or XY chromosomes. And as I mentioned, that's a similar representation demographically in Canada. Now, for example, chromosomes can vary. You could be XO, XXX, XXY, XYY, and so on. There are actually more than just two sexes. In fact, in the completion of human genetics, there are about 32 variations of XY genetics to describe humans. Not two, about 32. Some people are born with biological characteristics of each sex. Now, historically, they were labeled hermaphrodites, but today, intersexed is a preferred term. Now, under the same area in terms of biology and sex as a biological determination, hormones are very influential in our sexual development of male and female sex organs and how our bodies develop through life. Now, hormones are going to influence development. Like, for example, fetuses, when a Y chromosome is bathed in androgen, which aids in the development of male sex organs. Fetuses without a Y have fewer androgens and support the development of female sex organs. Female fetuses may be exposed to excessive progesterone and may not develop female genitalia, whereas male fetuses may be deprived of progesterone, then male genitalia may not develop. Biology influences how we develop but does not determine our behavior or personality. The environment is also an important developmental factor, and we'll talk about that a lot throughout the course. So that's just a quick, we're only trying to introduce this topic, but it's a quick review of sex and our biology. We're going to look next at gender. And how is it different from biology and the implications of the definition of gender of our day and lives? Gender is neither innate nor necessarily stable. It is more fluid. Gender varies throughout time, geography, within an individual person, and within relationships. Consider Canada, the United States. Masculinity is associated with strength, ambition, rationality, and emotional control, while femininity is generally associated with physical attractiveness, nurturing behavior, and concern with people and relationships. Now, gender is learned. Cultures stipulate the social meaning and expectations of each sex. So we tend to see in society's view of gender as being normal. We've been raised in our family in Canada. We understand how women are supposed to be feminine and how men are supposed to be masculine. And we grow up this way with those expectations and knowledge, so we mirror those expectations and cultural norms about gender. So these conventional views of both sex and gender are challenged by people who are transgendered and gender non-conforming. Role models can also embody alternatives to traditional gender identities. That brings us to another term, androgyny. Androgyny combines the qualities our culture considers both feminine and masculine qualities. So they put them together into one person, and that's the term androgyny. This meaning, or the meanings of gender, are arbitrary. What it means is different by culture, have dramatically different conceptions of masculinity and femininity. The body ideals for men and the body ideals for women change by time, by culture, by geographic location. Some cultures consider gender to be changeable across a lifetime. That is to say, your gender could change over your own lifetime, and that's accepted and expected in some cases. Some cultures recognize more than just 2 genders. There are cultures that know 3 or 5. The meaning of gender can even change over time in a single culture or a social group. Just the meaning of what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman in our culture has changed over the last 100 years. Gender is a relational concept. We can only understand masculinity in relation to femininity and vice versa. Changing ideas about one gender affects the ideas of another. So if we're looking beyond the sort of sex and gender, we tend to see sex and gender and sexuality as dichotomous, opposites, male, female. However, I hope we're beginning to see that things are not quite that straightforward. As I mentioned earlier, there's a term, cis, C-I-S, as a prefix for cisgender or cis woman, which is the designation that the person fits conventional categories, what is considered normal. Now, we've also alluded to sexual orientation, which refers to the person's preference for romantic and sexual partners. You're probably quite familiar, heterosexual people are attracted to people of different sex from their own. Gay men are attracted to men, and lesbian women are attracted to women. Bisexuals are attracted to both sexes. Now, our changing views of gender and sex means an increasing recognition for people who don't fit into the orthodox categories. Transgender or trans individuals find their biological sex doesn't match their gender identity. Sexual and romantic interests don't necessarily change because a person transitions from one sex to another. There are also some people who reject the idea of being one or the other sex. Transgender refers to individuals who feel that their biologically assigned sex does not match their true sexual identity. Now, should a transgender person choose to make the transition and takes hormones and has surgery to reassign their sex, then post-transition males to females usually refer to themselves as MTF, male to female. And females to males go by FTM, female to male. Most transitioned transgender people have the same sexual preferences before and after their surgery. So for example, if they were attracted to men before, they continue to be attracted to men. Not all. It's more fluid than just black and white. I put a couple of pictures up behind me. Jennifer Finney Boland is now James Richard Boyland. Jenna Telkova, she was a Canadian representative in the beauty pageant. I think it was the World Beauty Pageant. I can't remember exactly, maybe 10 years ago. But she was a transitioned. Now the other images are female to men individuals. And that's not one that generally gets an awful lot of attention. We don't notice. I have 2 cousins who both made a transition as young people in their 20s, and they have both been FTM. Transition men or females often gain a keen insight into the gender dynamics in cultural life because they've experienced being and being seen as more than just one sex. So they tend to see that more clearly. Now, culture we'll move to. I'm going to do just brief on this. We'll revisit this throughout the entire course. But culture is the structures, institutions, and practices that reflect and uphold social order. So that's politics, religion, government, education, healthcare, the economy, family. These are all institutions and structures. The practices are the way we live our lives and how we do what we do. For example, upholding social order, it's really kind of nice that we all drive on the right side of the road. That's one of the things that helps with social order, is that we all agree to these norms and laws that keep us all safe. Now, these are upheld by defining certain groups, values and expectations, meanings and patterns of behavior as good and others as bad or wrong. Societal views of gender are communicated through interpersonal interactions, media, cultural traditions, gender roles, and patterns of interaction within families, ideology, and practice of these institutions. For example, women have often in the past and still continue to give up their last name in marriage. Western culture is very patriarchal. Patriarchal, which is a term that means a dominant ideology in institutions and in practices were created by men and implicitly value masculine perspectives and priorities. Now, this results in a pervasive and naturalized view of the appropriate roles and behaviors for men and women, which we tend to take for granted. We seldom pause to reflect. We take for granted and we don't usually question. Learning to question these cultural prescriptions for gender empowers you to choose your own course of action and identity. And then lastly, we'll just briefly get into communication. Communication is a dynamic process without clear beginnings or ends. You can start a conversation today and be able to complete it tomorrow. The dynamic nature of communication emphasizes its ongoing nature. Communication may influence how we think, feel, and it influences our future interactions. Therefore, communication events do not have precise starting and ending points. Instead, it's more of a process over time. Systems influence how we interact and what meanings we attach to messages. More than context affects meaning, all aspects of communication are interlinked and influenced by how we feel, the time of the day, the place. All can influence our communication. The largest system affecting communication is culture, society's views, and the treatment of men and women that change over time. Now, communication has two levels. There's the first level, which is content level of meaning. This is the literal meaning of things. The content level is the literal meaning of a message, which also implies an appropriate response. However, the second level of meaning is relationship level. This defines the relationship between communicators by indicating each person's identity and the communicator's relationship to each other. Now, that's a very basic psychological need, and that's one of the things that communication can provide. The relationship level of meaning is particularly important in reflecting and affecting how people feel about each other. It also tells us how to interpret the content level of meaning. Relationship levels of meaning are important when trying to understand gender patterns of communication. The more important level of meaning is usually the relationship level, which deals with the conversational partner's right to interrupt, dismiss his or her topic, and initiate his or her own part. Meanings are created in the process of human interaction with symbols, because we are really very much symbol-using creatures. Symbols are our language, things that mean other things. Symbols are abstract, they're ambiguous, and they're arbitrary ways of representing phenomena which do not have any inherent qualities. Now, meanings don't exist in words or in the symbols themselves. We give them meaning. We learn what the significance of the Canadian flag is. We don't see the flag and know exactly what it means. We learn that. Symbolic communication requires reflection and thought for interpretation. Individuals, you and I, construct an interpretation of communication, and it's influenced by many factors. We draw on our past experience, and just that alone, we know that your past experience and mine are not the same. We also look towards knowledge of the people with whom we're interacting. You know stuff that I don't know, and I know stuff that you don't know. And other factors in the communication system. There's much. It's our difference in interpretation that's our source of misunderstanding. We can become more effective as a communicator by first, ask for clarification, and secondly, check to see how others are interpreting us. Well, this completes Chapter 1. It's been an introduction of sex, gender, culture, and communication, and we will be revisiting these concepts throughout the semester. Next week, we're going to explore theoretical approaches to understand gender development. We're going to consider the biological theories, interpersonal theories, cultural theories, and critical theories. Remember, critical theories look at understanding the problems in inequities or the social problems. So they're a little bit different than the biological, interpersonal, and cultural. So where we are, everybody. We'll see you next week. I hope things are going well. Bye now.